Welcome to the Battles We Pick podcast, where advocates and organizers talk about the work of making social, political, and policy change. Today I'm talking to my friend Suzanne Nossel, CEO of PEN America, a national network of writers which is the leading human rights advocacy group for the right to freedom of expression. Suzanne's book on the subject is titled Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. Suzanne trained as an attorney but has spent most of her career championing human rights and democracy through support for free elections in South Africa, serving as a top executive at Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International USA, and as the Assistant Secretary of State in the Department's International Organizations Bureau with responsibility for human rights. In the podcast, we talked about how she views that career path, as well as her perspective as the daughter of immigrants from South Africa and granddaughter of a Holocaust victim. Given Suzanne's vantage with an organization on the front lines of the struggle against creeping authoritarianism in this country, we focus mainly on that threat and what PEN America is learning about the best ways to resist it. We talked a lot about right-wing efforts to ban books, the shifting American demographics that are sparking so much fear and repressive impulses on the right, and today's turbocharged discourse that all political players are unfortunately stuck in. I know you'll find the conversation as interesting as I did. With today's episode, I go back to having the type of guest I had for most of the first episodes of the podcast, meaning I'm talking today with a longtime valued colleague and friend. Suzanne Nossel and I go back about 17, 18 years or so. When I was a foreign policy maven, Suzanne was my co-author at least 2 or 3 times, lucky me. We first connected because Suzanne was the founder of an important blog called Democracy Arsenal, which was a collective of foreign policy experts from the Democratic side of the aisle, including yours truly. Basically, we posted a lot of different arguments and critiques for why Democrats were the better party on foreign policy and national security. Arguments made easy by the disastrous George W. Bush invasion of Iraq. Currently, Suzanne leads PEN America, the organization of writers that advocates for freedom of expression. And last winter, Suzanne published an important article in Foreign Affairs magazine called The Real Culture Wars, which is about the current global contest between democracy and authoritarianism, between freedom and repression. So much to discuss, but I'm thrilled to have Suzanne, and thank you so much for doing this.
Sure, of course. It's great to be with you again, David.
Thanks.
Just like old times.
So, I know. So where I would like to start is this strange moment for our country. We seem to be in some kind of case where we don't recognize what's at stake. The politics of the moment seem not to reflect that larger culture war. And the organization you lead is at the front lines of this. How do you look at it, and how do you deal with it?
Yeah, look, I share your sense that it's almost a kind of sleepwalking towards something that could be a cliff for this country and our democracy. And the level of alarm and consternation and mobilization and activation just does not seem to be what is warranted to meet this moment. I mean, when you invoke the days of George W. Bush and the things we were worried about at the time, the Iraq War and excesses of White House power, they so pale in comparison with what we saw during the Trump administration, and what we are on notice may be on its way back at even greater velocity and ferocity for our country. And so I too worry that we are at risk of not meeting this moment. And look, there are a range of reasons why. I think a piece of it is exhaustion and just people having been beaten down by fighting these fights over time, the election of Trump, the pandemic, January 6th, it's been sort of one thing after the next. We've never kind of gone back to what has felt remotely like a normal and stable moment in this country, increasing polarization. And so I think there's some sense of just people being out of steam and out of ideas. I think there is also this incredibly pronounced polarization intensified by social media, where people are being manipulated. They don't know what to believe. They are looking at videos and posts online and unable to distinguish fact from falsehood. That problem is intensifying with the spread of AI. And we know from our work at Penn America that in authoritarian settings, that is what happens. People lose their moorings in the truth. They no longer know who or what to believe, and they tune out and are no longer engaged, have no sense of civic agency. And I worry that we're skating awfully close to that in this country.
So, yeah, I mean, I guess I was thinking of it as a forgetting important things about uh, what we're what our values are meant to be and how our system is supposed to work. But you make the important point that sort of that cultural or values governance battlefield has been prepared by the other side, and like they always do, right? That they've gaslit and deceived and distracted. So where does that leave us in terms of reconnecting with what we're supposed to believe in and how our system is supposed to work?
Yeah, yeah, it's a good question.
It caught my notice to hear James Carville, right, who ought to know about these things, say that he thinks that the threat of book banning carries a sort of a similar force with people and a similar sense of threat to the loss of reproductive freedoms. So I don't know, is that, how that squares with some of your experiences?
Yeah, I mean, book banning is a good example because when you point out to people that, as we have documented at Penn America, there are more than 6,000 books that have been banned in communities across the country just over the last 3 years, and that in some instances, books are being banned throughout counties that serve tens of thousands of students. And this can happen at the behest of a single individual who lodges an objection and gets the book withdrawn from the shelves for a lengthy period, if not forever. That does mobilize people. Americans don't like book bans. There's a recognition that the freedom to read is an elemental part of childhood, that individual citizens shouldn't be dictating what others can take in and absorb, that those are not decisions that we want people to be able to make for one another, to dictate that their values should override those of someone else. And so we have found that to be a galvanizing issue when it is cast accurately and vividly for people. Of course, like with everything else, there's a battle of the framings. And the framing on the other side is this is a matter of parental rights. This is the ability of families to determine what their children are exposed to and to protect children who are too young or to safeguard against ideas that they see as threatening or dangerous or corrupting in some way. And when people hear it through that frame, they have a tendency to say, oh, well, isn't that just a normal parental instinct? Isn't that the prerogative of a mother or a father to decide what their child ought to read or not? And the fact is, of course, parents have rights. Of course, you can determine what your minor child gets to read or bring into your house. But that's not what this is about. This is about some parents try to dictate what everybody else in the community or even the county is permitted to read. And so that goes back to the challenge with our discourse and the way people get their information, the ability to use social media channels so effectively to purvey messages with a particular ideological agenda to distort. And look, it's not limited to any one side. We see this on all sides of our politics and civic life, and it's kind of an arms race: who has the best video or meme or viral post that can take over the conversation and frame the issue in people's minds and shape perceptions so powerfully. And so getting that right becomes incredibly important. And of course, one feels like it's just communications, it should be about the substance and not the message, and yet those things really tend to converge. And if you don't get the message right, the substance can be completely snowed under.
Oh, I guess I keep looping back to sort of what's happened to the civic culture, right? The culture in another sense, because if it were stronger, wouldn't there be more of a quicker recognition that's banning, that taking that book from the library isn't just keeping it away from your kids; it's keeping it away from all kids, right? Like, I think we have had some sort of democratic backsliding that has to do with tuning out. I don't know.
Yeah, look, I think to me, there's also an important part of this that is grounded in the challenges we're facing as a uniquely pluralistic society, a society that over time demographically will soon have no one single racial majority that is comprised of so many different immigrant communities, that is socioeconomically stratified, and what it means to find cohesion and common purpose in that kind of polity. And the idea, even when you talk about kind of our values or the values we should believe in, well, the values that, who should believe in, who sets those values, and the values that you and I may have come of age thinking were fundamental and basic may not be shared by other people in this country from different backgrounds. We see in communities that when it comes to books, there may be very different attitudes about how to deal with certain issues. At what is the right age to engage with questions of LGBTQ identity or gender fluidity? For some people, that's just part of childhood. It should be introduced as soon as a child is curious enough to pick up a book from the shelf or ask a question. To other people, the very availability of those narratives and ideas is undermining to their notions of family and community and social values, perhaps religious values. And so having people cheek to jowl with heterogeneous opinions, that's always happened in this country. I mean, I think of New York City, where I live, as a place where we are accustomed to that. You ride the subway every morning, and it's a huge swath of society, people of all different age groups, backgrounds, socioeconomic status, employment, lifestyle, religion. And the whole country is moving in that direction, but it does take a certain amount of navigation and norm setting to kind of make that work. And I think that is part of the reason why we're experiencing so many of these tensions now. And of course, it's that demographic transformation is overlapping with the digital transformation. So the traditional channels that we might have used, a local newspaper or a fair or a festival or assembly in the auditorium, those have given way to other channels of communication and information that are much more fragmented, and where people have a much easier time finding the like-minded and doubling down on what it is that they already believe in. And so what a melting pot looks like in sort of the 21st century, I think we have yet to really figure out.
Well,
Whether it's a
that's a
melting
really good,
pot or a mosaic,
yeah,
or whatever metaphor one might want to use.
a mixed salad that's another one used to talk about. But um, I'm glad you brought up the LGBTQ issue, um, which of course is so connected, and particularly by Moms for Liberty, etc., with that notion of parental rights. What what's missing from that way of looking at it is this phantom threat of um, bathroom assaults by transgender um, girls. It gets built up into this huge thing where the trans kids themselves, will tell you that the much more real and common threat is when gender identity isn't supported in the home. We don't extend. You Parental rights are not a free ticket, right? Some parents are abusive, right? I mean, let's not romanticize. Um, whose whose rights are and safety is most at risk. And I think that gets skewed the wrong direction.
Yeah, look, absolutely. I mean, some of the most banned books that we deal with in the country are narratives about gender identity. All boys are blue, or gender queer. And these books are explicit, they're very direct, they are intended for older teens. And they can, for some people who may pick them up, this is not the young adult book that you remember. This is not, Judy Blume. It's something different. But what we hear time and again from teachers and librarians, including and particularly in rural and more conservative parts of the country, is that these books can be a lifeline for students who are living in a community that does not accept their identity. They're perhaps living in a family that doesn't want to recognize them for who they are. They can feel enormously isolated and stigmatized, and as if there is no future for them. And by picking up a book like this, it is a window into a set of possibilities for a life that they can live. It tells them that there are people who have walked down this path before, even though they may not know anyone. May not be anyone in their school or in their town who is similar to them or who they can identify with, to find somebody in the pages of a book who speaks to them, who knows their struggles, who can point to possibilities for the way forward, can be incredibly life affirming and empowering. It really is a potent illustration of the force of books, the influence of books, why books are so essential, what is at stake when we ban books or when we make books available. And so I think it's incredibly important to recognize that. And, one of the challenges with all of this that I think about is that, they're just such different standards. I mean, for one person, a book is life saving, and, for somebody else, it's an abomination. And we cannot, in a free society, dictate how each person reacts. And we have to find some way of addressing those drastically different points of view, and people who are incredibly threatened and unsettled by a book like that, who may feel like it affronts their values or their religion, their way of life. And we may disagree with that vehemently, but we can't necessarily make that perspective go away or disappear or talk them out of it or even necessarily legislate them out of it. And so, how do we move forward to try to instill a greater sense of openness? And, I think we have many examples in our society, whether it's on racial equality or uh, gay marriage, where the norms do change and something that people view as incredibly unsettling and contrary to their value system and undermining to their notion of community takes hold, and the courts affirm it, society affirms it, and everyone gets used to it and they get with the program, and all of a sudden the next generation doesn't call it into question. So we've seen great progress in some areas, and we've also seen some rolling back. I mean, what we saw in the Dobbs decision, abortion, which was a sacrosanct right that, for our generation, we grew up with. It was sort of without question. It was a settled matter. Now no longer. And so it requires an enormous amount of vigilance and also hopefulness that, ultimately, if you fight these battles, that while maybe two steps forward, one step back, that there is some progress. And I do think we see that in our society, when it comes to racial equality and gender equality. We are not now where we were, 40 or 50 years ago.
The main thing that I was thinking as you were talking about these issues in communities and schools is like, if only there were people who work in these buildings who, sort of have that skill set relating to connecting students and kids with the books that will be most helpful and useful to them. Right? I mean, I think there's an issue having to do with trust in education and library professionals.
Yes, there is. Certainly. And look, in our work, we encounter a great many librarians and teachers who are enormously dedicated, who recognize the life affirming and even life saving potential of books, who take their work incredibly seriously, who have, in some instances, come under real fire with disciplinary reprisals, losing their jobs in some cases, coming under physical threat, psychological abuse for carrying out their professional duties in a responsible way and serving the needs of children and a community by being a source of books and ideas that people need and want to be exposed to. So I think there's a tremendous assault on educators that is deeply troubling. I mean, even if you disagree with someone's judgment, to cast into doubt their credibility, to try to undermine them personally and campaign against them and suggest that they're acting in bad faith, tears at the fabric of these communities and at the sense of trust in our institutions. So I think some of the tactics that have been engaged in this battle are really very destructive. I think it was exacerbated during the pandemic when people were very frustrated with what was happening in the schools and the learning loss and the disruption and the debates over whether children should go back to school. I think that compounded a sense of grievance in relation to our schools that we have yet to fully purge and move beyond. But it's honestly such a pernicious way for parents and community members to look at these individuals who have such a formative influence over our youth and who we depend upon to educate our children and also to cultivate rising generations of citizens in a democracy. There's so much to it. And so I think that propensity, that wave to just denigrate and demean educators and librarians is, that's something I don't think we've seen before quite in this country. Maybe a version of it during the McCarthy era.
I think that does get at the core of what good faith means, right? Um, we ought to be able to have a civil discourse that gives credit um, that educators who work in our schools, um, want the best for the kids, want them to grow and develop and learn. I guess not for nothing that we're focused more and more on the sort of Christian nationalism piece, right? Because if there's a constituency that is sort of insisting that education conforms to a particular viewpoint, and that is trying to, enforce some orthodoxy, that's probably the source of a lot of it.
I think that's part of that. I think it's certainly one strain, that is influencing our Supreme Court and our politics, and it's sort of the weaponization of religion and the tension between religious fealty and what it takes to live in a pluralistic democracy with people who hold very different religious views. And that's always been such a cornerstone of this country: the separation of church and state, the belief in religious pluralism and religious diversity. And so the idea that there would be one dogma, one religious vision that should predominate, that is so righteous and unassailable that it needs to be the basis for our national law, or for how we interpret the Constitution, to me really runs counter to the fundamentals of what this country was founded on. It's just the idea that those religious traditions would all have their place, but that no single one would be allowed to dominate. So I do worry that that conception is being lost.
You lead an organization that tackles these issues in many ways, on many fronts, different issues under the umbrella. What in your time leading PEN America, what can you share about the work of being active as an organization on different fronts?
Yeah, look, it's been both challenging and exciting. One of my signatures here at PEN America has been what I think of as the effort to create and sustain the Big Tent organization, an organization that cuts across a lot of these divisions by bringing together a heterogeneous group of writers and stakeholders of other kinds, readers, advocates, supporters, who may have very different views on almost everything, but can come together in opposition to a banned book or in support of an imperiled writer who's sitting in jail somewhere around the world. And to me, that's a very powerful notion, especially in our polarized society, of being able to bring people together because they can find some common cause, not because they agree on everything, but almost in spite of the fact that they don't agree on very much. And so holding that together, being aware of all the fault lines and the breakpoints and the sensitivities among this polyglot group of constituencies, and trying to navigate that has been for me very challenging. It's particularly challenged right now. I think carrying it out over 10 or 11 years is in this political environment has been quite extraordinary. And ultimately, I think it's very important. I think that we need to be able to make common cause with people who have different beliefs. We need to be able to find what we can agree on, even though we're not going to agree on everything. And I fear that openness is being lost and narrowed.
So, can you tell us about places and instances when you've seen it, when um, that coming together of people who are quite different, um, sort of really manifests something, and what tell us a little bit more about that, the dynamism that results.
Yeah, I mean, book banning is a good example because it has been such a galvanizing issue for us. We're a writers' organization, so everybody, by definition, cares about authors and books, and there's a reflexive opposition to book banning, and it really has been exceptionally unifying. We have very extremely progressive writers of color, writers who are gender non-binary or transgender, whose books have come under attack, who are at the forefront of advocacy. But they're also much more mainstream, best-selling authors, a group of best-selling authors in Florida that really is not a particularly kind of political group. It's authors whose books you see everywhere in Barnes and Noble, in the library, at the airport. They're huge names, and they've come together to support the work defending the freedom to read uh, in Florida. And so that kind of common cause where authors from all different communities of all different stripes, very different audiences, some may be highbrow literary writers, some may be uh, very popular, sort of best-selling paperback writers, and they all come together around the defense of books.
And what does a win look like?
Yeah, I mean, we have a lawsuit. We defeated the government's motion to dismiss in our lawsuit challenging book bans in Escambia County. We had a series of successes in the Florida state legislature this year, beating back censorious legislation. And so when people come together in broad coalition, there's an enormous amount that can be accomplished.
I also wanted to ask you, because I've known you for a while and I'm familiar with your professional career path, you were in government, senior State Department official, for issues of human rights internationally, um, and the diplomacy of protecting freedoms. Um, the Washington think tank community, other advocacy groups, and now the large advocacy group you lead. Um, what thoughts do you have about what those different experiences have equipped you with, how you draw on them in your work?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's all cumulative and everything builds on everything else. My earliest experiences, whether it was working in South Africa right after college and taking inspiration from that movement for freedom and watching some really remarkable leaders and how they stepped to the foreground and how they galvanized people. That was incredibly influential. So was working for just a brief stint at McKinsey Consulting and learning how to walk into a situation and tackle a problem and develop data and information to guide solutions and help bring about a common understanding and fact based so that people look at a problem through the same angle. So I really do feel like everything kind of builds on everything else. My time working in the multilateral arena and the experience of having to rally support for initiatives and do vote counting and work on multiple dimensions of a problem where you've got two or three different strategies that are in place at the same time as fallbacks for one another. So, to me, kind of everything, it may seem as though my career is all over the place, but to me, it's all quite tightly linked.
Am I right that that you have family connection to South Africa,
Yes, my parents were both born and raised there.
making you a first generation American?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So, uh, how much of that sensibility and your connection to the immigrant experience would you say is at work as you approach these issues?
I think heavily so. I mean, I think my personal background, my family background, my mother's family were, my great grandmother is a Holocaust victim who died in Theresienstadt. My grandparents escaped from Germany. I've certainly thought a lot about that background, especially in the last 9 months, and how it framed my upbringing and how I look at the world. Also the connection to South Africa, the injustice there, the chance to be part of the transformation there in the 1990s when it was coming out from under apartheid. So, all of that runs very deep for me.
Well, Suzanne, thank you so much. This is a great conversation. I love doing the podcast because it enables me to do this and appreciate when old friends like yourself are generous with your time.
Great to talk to you, David. Be well.
Thank you for the
Take care. Bye
opportunity.
bye.
Yeah, thanks.
Can I hang up, or do you need me? Does it need to like load it or something?
Well,